This is the ultimate version of Tecmo's NBA basketball game. And actually, these are two different games. One came out for the Super Nintendo back in March 1993. The other one came out for the Sega Genesis in December 1993. Despite the 9-month gap, the games are almost identical. And that's both a good thing and a bad thing. Well, if you're like me, you probably only remember Tecmo NBA Basketball being a hit NES game. It was the only NES game around that let you play a full NBA season. It had all of the teams. It had real teams with real players. And it is fun to play, at least for the most part. The most impressive part about the NES game was all of its stat-keeping capabilities. Now this is similar to Tecmo Super Bowl, which really is the gold standard for NES battery saving. Now the actual game part of the basketball game was pretty weak. I mean, the players all look more or less the same. It's really hard to tell even who you are, especially if the players are all in a crowd. And there really isn't much strategy. The best way to play the game on defense is to just spam the B button. And on offense, you want to run fast breaks all the time. Now, the graphics are not awful. The game is actually playable. I should give it credit for that. But this still seriously is one of those games where you really have to use your imagination. Now, I know that this is an NES game. I'm not expecting the players to, actually look like real-life players. But the strategy in this game doesn't even resemble the NBA of the early 1990s. So in Tecmo, the best way to play offense is to just run a fast break every single time down the court. Now, I mean, if you watch enough of these old games, you will see some pretty bizarre things take place, like this play.
Punches it away, but Jordan chases it down. What a pass. Well, that's the speed and quickness of Chicago. See, Michael Jordan gets his...
But for the most part, basketball in the early 1990s was an isolation game, just like this. It was a very defensive game that was dominated by guys who had good position. It was basically the opposite of Tecmo NBA Basketball. In other words, you're never going to see that kind of half-court offensive system work in this game. But some of those problems are probably because of the limited processing ability of the NES, right? Well, let's take a closer look at those 16-bit versions. Well, we'll look at the Super NES version first, since it came out first. This is the one that came out in March 1993. Now, back in early 1993, this list of features would have made any kid go crazy. And the other crazy thing is that these screenshots in the back of the cartridge actually don't do the game justice. The game itself, though, is pretty much the same as the NES game. So on defense, you want to spam the Y button, since that's the steal button. The trick is to push A all the time to try to get to the guy who is in front of the opponent who has the ball. Then you just spam Y until you either foul him or the ball pops loose. And if you're too late, they blow past you for an easy slam dunk. So, in other words, Tecmo unfortunately was not able to figure out how to make it, like the real NBA. It's basically a game where you try to steal the ball and then you go dunk it. That's all you do. In fact, it's not really that much different than Double Dribble on the NES, aside from having players with different ability levels. You use the same strategy in both games. Now, it's a lot easier to figure out who you're controlling in the Super NES game. That really bad flickering is gone. However, there's always strange stuff that happens. If you have the ball, you soon discover that you can drive down the middle of the lane without any problems. The defenders will literally get out of your way if you try to do this. So great blocks like this one don't really happen in this game, not for the most part at least. Generally, I found that the computer has the ability to time the blocks right, but I don't. Now, there is an improvement over the NES game, that's for sure. In the NES game, you really have to constantly hit the A button on defense since your computer-controlled teammates won't do anything. In that sense, the Super NES version feels more like basketball. But to be honest with you, I still found it to be pretty underwhelming. In fact, I hate to say it, but I really don't know if the game's that much fun for me to play. Literally, this is just a fast break machine. Now, the real interesting thing about the Super NES version is that its production was delayed for a long time, even though it seems that they planned to make this version before the NES game. At least that's what this April 1992 issue of GamePro makes me believe. There's no mention of the NES version anywhere here. So to give you an idea of when this was, this same issue had this preview of Bulls vs. Lakers, which came out on both the Genesis and Super NES a few months before Tecmo. But if you look closely, you'll realize that EA's game only featured 16 teams plus the 2 All-Star teams. And you might have a hard time finding this issue anyway since Michael Jordan's on the cover. Now in the end, GamePro featured the NES version in its January 1993 issue right after the game came out. Naturally, the review mentioned the sprite flickering problems, but I guess this score was actually okay. Anyway, the same issue featured this preview of the Super NES version. The prediction back then was that it would come out by February 1993. In the end though, the Super NES game was delayed, and so this review didn't come out until April 1993. And of course, there was criticism of the graphics. Now, I do think that Tecmo can be forgiven for not having great graphics in the NES version. I mean, it's a miracle that the game even came out on the NES, and it really did stretch the 8-bit system to its limits. But for the Super NES version, this just doesn't feel adequate. There seem to only be 2 different sprites in the game. This means that Jordan has hair and he looks just like Pippen. It's not that that matters anyway, since when you pass the ball you can't really do anything to change the person that you're passing it to. But when all is said and done, the stat features are still pretty cool for a game from this age. That's the conclusion that GamePro came to, but the final score was lukewarm, maybe average? Alright, I'm not going to second guess GamePro too much, I mean it's been over 30 years now, but I do find it interesting that they gave the NES version a better score for gameplay. I would honestly much rather play the Super NES version, at least then I can see who I'm controlling. Anyway, the Genesis version wasn't released until December 1993, and like I said before, it is the same game as the Super NES version. Because this game came out later, Michael Jordan is called Guard Bulls. Remember, too, that Jordan's name was censored out of the second revision of the NES game. The same is true for the second revision of the Super NES game. If you want to play the Genesis version, you have no choice. You can only use the generic version of Jordan. The gameplay here is exactly the same as the Super NES version. As usual, you can drive the lane without anybody getting in your way. And you might as well forget about passing, considering all the dumb things that happen when you try it. And on defense, you just spam the steal button. Of course, the fact that it took that much time for the Genesis version to come out makes you wonder what in the world the delay was. Now, the Genesis and Super NES versions of Tecmo Super Bowl, that is the football game, were both released in November 1993. I've got no idea why the basketball game on the Genesis was delayed that long, especially since it is literally the same game as the Super NES version. Now, one thing I didn't mention in my NES review is that you can call plays in this game. This Nintendo Power feature shows this off, and it's kind of cool, but I've never been able to get it to work right on the NES. Well, I tried this on the Genesis, and I had the ball stripped away from me every single time. I mean, I guess at least I can see the guys trying to come over to set a pick. But other things in the NBA at that time, like losing your defender when he turns his back, none of that is anywhere in Tecmo Super NBA Basketball. In all three versions, your best bet is to just run a fast break the entire time. But, I mean, at least the stats come out okay, right? After a sample Super NES game, I noticed that Scottie Pippen seemed a little bit overpowered. I mean, our shooting percentage was high, it was almost 70%, but it's still believable. Pippen was also the high scorer in the Genesis game that I played. And here the shooting percentages were really off the charts. I noticed too that Pippen's name did not come up among the scoring leaders on the Genesis despite the 45 points he scored on opening night. In other words, really there are a lot of bugs with these games, including things that I think most people haven't quite noticed yet. And I mean, I can't blame them. You know, NBA Jam was such a huge hit when both of these games first came out that nobody really wanted to play anything else. I mean, the biggest problem with these Techno games is that defense is practically impossible. The game is just too stiff. I can figure out how to block shots on NBA Jam. Sure, strange things will happen, but at least I feel like I know where I am and that I have some kind of control. I know that it's a later game and I have criticized it a bit, but I also feel like Run and Gun is a much better basketball sim than Tecmo. The flow of this game feels a lot more like real basketball. Now the game is probably a little bit too much focused on fast breaks, but is also a lot more fun to play than Tecmo. The Techmo NBA games feel like a chore after a while, and that's not a great thing. But that doesn't mean that these games were awful. I do think that they were good for their time, though unfortunately they had a very limited shelf life. Despite the fact that the NES version got a 4-page feature, Nintendo Power still gave it pretty low ratings back in December 1992. The Super Nintendo game did a little bit better a couple months later, but only a little bit, and remember that these scores were out of 5 points. Larry Flint's Video Games magazine seems to have been the only magazine that bothered to give the Genesis game a rating back in January 1994. This 5 rating really says it all, it's out of 10 points. And the problem was the combination of old-fashioned graphics and really bad gameplay. And it makes sense. I mean, just look at NBA Jam on the Genesis, which came out 8 months earlier. Seriously, which game would you rather play? Now, the reason why Tecmo Super Bowl and the NES is so well loved is because you can use different strategies. It's fantastic how the game gets harder as you go on a winning streak. The problem with the Techmo NBA basketball games is that you basically use the same strategy every single time down the court for all 3 games. There's absolutely no variety in gameplay. And unfortunately, this gets really boring really quick. Anyway, there you have it. It honestly was not really until the NBA Live series came out a little bit later on that we had a good 5-on-5 console basketball game. And even then, the early NBA Live games have some issues. Now, I do like playing Tecmo Super NBA Basketball from time to time, though honestly, I can really only stand playing one game at a time. It's too repetitive after a while, and it's about as much fun as like going to wash the dishes.